This Notebook LM video explores how Christianity, built on forgiveness and peace, for centuries justified persecution and even execution of dissenters. It reveals how Scripture and theology were used both to justify acts of violence and to promote tolerance, leaving modern Christianity to grapple with reconciling ancient texts with a changing moral perspective.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a paradox, a really troubling one that has haunted Christianity for centuries.
So here's the core question we're looking at today. It's a massive contradiction, right? One that literally shaped history. How did a faith built on forgiveness become, for a very long time, a faith of fire?
I mean, think about it. On the one hand, you've got these core teachings of Christ, all about peace. But on the other hand, you have this huge stretch of history, over 1,000 years, where religious leaders used that same faith to justify extreme violence. And this was against people they labeled heretics, basically anyone whose beliefs didn't line up with the official doctrine.
And that's the puzzle, isn't it? If killing heretics was so wrong, why did so many really respected saints and theologians do it? But if it was right, well, why did it stop? That's what we're going to unpack, and it's a story that's been debated for a long and often bloody time.
Okay, so first up, this fundamental contradiction of faith.
Right, let's get into the weeds. How on earth did they justify this? Let's build the theological case for using force, quote, for coercion.
Well, a lot of the justifications started way back in the Old Testament. You have passages like this one from Deuteronomy, which seems like a pretty direct command from God. Execute anyone who leads people to worship other gods. So for the people who were pushing for persecution, this wasn't just, an opinion. They saw it as a divine order to protect the entire community from spiritual poison. And then you get something called the doctrine of coercion. This is fascinating and pretty disturbing. It's all based on this one line from a parable in the Gospel of Luke. Compel them to enter. Now, the story is actually about a banquet. It's about radical hospitality, getting everyone to the party. But St. Augustine, one of the most influential thinkers in all of Christian history, mind you, he takes that phrase and completely reinterprets it. He uses it to justify using the power of the state, using force to bring people into the church and keep it unified. A huge shift.
And it didn't stop there. Centuries later, you have another giant of theology, Thomas Aquinas, and he takes this logic and pushes it to its chilling conclusion. His argument was devastatingly simple. Look, he said, if the government can execute someone for a crime like counterfeiting money, which is just a crime against temporal life, then doesn't it have an even greater duty to execute a heretic? After all, a heretic is a criminal against God, and their crime doesn't just mess with earthly things. It endangers souls for all of eternity.
And this is absolutely crucial to understand. For the rulers and the clergy, heresy wasn't just a private spiritual matter. No way. It was seen as treason. You have to remember, in this world, the church and the state were basically welded together. So to challenge the official religion was to threaten the entire social and political order. It was seen as the first step toward chaos and rebellion.
So these weren't just dusty theological debates happening in a library somewhere. These ideas had real and incredibly deadly consequences for actual people. Let's look at a case study, the trial of Michael Servetus.
Okay, so who was Michael Servetus? He was a brilliant Spanish doctor and theologian, but he had a big problem. He publicly questioned the doctrine of the Trinity. This put him in the crosshairs of pretty much everyone, but especially John Calvin, the powerful leader of Protestant Geneva. What happened next is It's a truly chilling example of what happens when theological conviction gets the power of the sword.
And just look at this quote from Calvin himself. This letter was written 7 years before Servetus was arrested in Geneva. He says, flat out, if he shall come, I shall never permit him to depart alive. This wasn't some snap decision made in the heat of the moment. The intent was there, in writing, for years.
So how responsible was Calvin? It's a really complex debate. His defenders will point out he wasn't a civil judge, he didn't cast the final vote. He even asked for a more humane form of execution. But his critics point to the fact that he was the one who identified Servetus to the authorities, and his entire theology supported the state's right to do this. There's no denying his influence was absolutely pivotal. It's a messy, tangled story of power and belief.
But, and this is a huge but, that wasn't the only interpretation out there. There was a powerful counterargument for tolerance. And guess what? It came from the very same scriptures. It was a viewpoint that, despite all the persecution, just refused to go away. So, what did this counter-argument sound like? Well, people pointed directly to Christ's own instructions to his disciples. He says in Matthew, if a town doesn't receive you, what do? Do you call down fire from heaven? No, you shake the dust off your feet and you leave. It's a pretty stark contrast to burning people at the stake, right? And here's a really key theological point they made. They argued you have to distinguish between different types of law in the Bible. You have the eternal moral law, don't murder. But you also have civil and ceremonial laws that were specific to ancient Israel. The command to execute heretics, they said, fell into that second category. It was fulfilled by Christ and no longer applied. I love this analogy one source uses. It's the same reason Christians today can eat a cheeseburger, something that was totally forbidden by Old Testament ceremonial law. That law just isn't binding anymore. So you see, this whole case for tolerance paints a very different picture of Christianity. It argues that the nature of the faith fundamentally changed with the new covenant. This was a faith that grew not by the sword, but through the blood of the martyrs. Paul was constantly dealing with heretics, but he never ordered them to be killed. And for the first few centuries of the church, the harshest punishment for heresy wasn't death. It was being kicked out, exile.
So where did this all lead? What's the legacy of this massive centuries-long debate? Well, it's a profound shift, really. A slow, painful move away from coercion and toward the idea of individual conscience. And you might be surprised to learn just how recently the final official break with some of these past justifications actually happened. That's right, 2017. In that year, the Catechism of the Catholic Church was updated, and Pope Francis declared the death penalty inadmissible in all cases. It's really the culmination of this long, twisting theological journey, heavily influenced, of course, by Enlightenment ideas about human rights and religious freedom. And so, this entire centuries-long struggle leaves us with a really big question, one that's just as relevant today as it ever was. How should any society that's built on foundational, ancient texts balance the authority of those texts with our own evolving moral understanding? It's a tough one, and it's a question that every single generation, I think, has to wrestle with for itself.